We were staring at a ghost that defied categorization. By exploiting a blind spot in our radar, it turned the ocean into an undefended highway. If they launched a fleet, our carriers would be burning steel before we could even scramble a single jet to intercept. The silence in the bunker was not empty. It was pressurized. It possessed a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums, a heavy blanket woven from secrets and the stale, recycled air of the underground. Robert Vance sat hunched over the light table, his spine curved into the permanent question mark of a career spent leaning toward the illuminated truth. The analyst's stoop, the agency doctors called it, a skeletal deformation earned by the men who fought the Cold War with magnifying loupes instead of rifles. He rubbed his eyes. The capillaries were swollen, a roadmap of red exhaustion traversing the pale white of his sclera. The National Photographic Interpretation Center existed outside of the circadian rhythm. Here, 80 feet beneath the manicured lawns of Washington, the sun neither rose nor set. There was only the hum, the constant, electric vibration of fluorescent ballasts drilling a low-frequency headache into Robert's temples. The air smelled of ozone, burnt circuit boards, and the acrid, lingering ghost of cold coffee. It was the scent of a hospital waiting room where the diagnosis is always terminal. Robert adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses. He did not trust the world outside this room. Out there, politicians shook hands and spoke of détente. Out there, families bought station wagons and grilled hamburgers. But Robert knew the architecture of their safety was built on a foundation of paranoia. He was the watchman. His burden was the terrifying logic of the false negative. The missile silo missed in a snowstorm, the submarine pen hidden by a cloud layer. Peace was a variable maintained only by the total loss of privacy. A hydraulic hiss shattered the quiet. The heavy steel security door cycled open. 2 Marines stepped through, flanking a courier in a gray nondescript suit. The man carried a battered metal canister with the trembling reverence usually reserved for a holy relic or a live warhead. The cylinder was scorched, the paint blistered and peeling, scarred by temperatures that could boil steel. It had fallen from the heavens. A payload from the KH-7 Gambit satellite, ejected from orbit, tumbling through the ionosphere, scorching its way through the atmosphere to be snatched midair by a C-130 over the Pacific. It was a miracle of logistics and physics, a celestial relay race run to deliver a roll of acetate film to a basement in D.C. Robert watched the handover. His pulse registered a minor uptick. The data inside that canister had traveled through the vacuum of space, drifting silently over the Iron Curtain, indifferent to borders and treaties. It had seen what the Soviets tried to bury. Fresh from the oven, the courier said, placing the canister on the intake desk. The voice was too loud, too cheerful for the sepulchral atmosphere of the analysis floor. Robert did not respond. He signed the chain of custody form, his pen scratching loudly in the stillness. The ritual of preparation began. It was a liturgy Robert performed with the unconscious competence of a priest. He cracked the seal. The smell of chemical fixative bloomed, sharp and vinegar-like, cutting through the ozone. He lifted the heavy reel of film, the acetate wide and pristine. Beside him, a chair squeaked. The sound of a match striking a rough strip was a violent tear in the silence. Jack Simmons inhaled. The tip of his cigarette flared orange, illuminating the deep, craggy lines of his face. He exhaled a thick, blue cloud that swirled in the beam of the light table. Simmons was a violation of protocol, a walking health code infraction in a rumpled polyester suit, but his eyes possessed a feral sharpness that the agency needed. Showtime, Simmons rasped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. Robert ignored the smoke. He threaded the film through the spools of the Richards light table. The mechanism engaged with a rhythmic click-whir, a mechanical heartbeat. He lowered the optics. He did not look at the film, he entered it. The world contracted. The bunker, the headache, the smell of smoke. It all dissolved. There was only the frame. The stark, high-contrast monochrome of the Soviet Union flooded his vision. This was the Caspian Sea. Robert manipulated the control knobs, panning the optics south. He knew this coastline better than the street where he lived. He navigated the gray topography of the Absheron Peninsula, counting the pixels of the enemy's industrial might. Grainy docks appeared, warehouses, the skeletal fingers of cranes reaching over black water. Robert's brain shifted into processing mode, a binary sifting of data. Normal, normal, normal. He checked the merchant fleet against the mental catalog stored in his hippocampus. A tanker at berth 3, a Sverdlov-class cruiser in dry dock, its hull stripped for refit. The shadows cast by the sun indicated the time of capture was mid-morning. He moved the view further south, toward the testing grounds near Caspian. The routine was a sedative. It lulled the mind into complacency, the dangerous whisper that today was the same as yesterday. He scanned the service roads, noting the tire tracks of heavy supply trucks. He checked the perimeter fences. Click whir. Next frame. Click whir. Next frame. His hand froze. The motion was involuntary, a primal brake engaged by the reptilian brain. Robert stopped the reel. He leaned in, his nose brushing the cold glass of the eyepiece. He blinked, expecting the image to resolve into something mundane. A cloud formation, a scratch on the emulsion, a processing error. It remained. In the center of the frame, miles from the sanctuary of the harbor, something sat on the water. It was a scar on the sea, a gray monolith. Robert frowned. His mind, usually a neatly filed cabinet of NATO designations, spun its gears, trying to jam the shape into a recognizable category. Destroyer? No. Too wide. Aircraft carrier? No. No flight deck. The geometry was alien. It possessed the brutality of Soviet engineering, function over form, but the scale was grotesque. It was a long, tapered fuselage, aggressive and predatory, capped with a massive tail stabilizer that rose like a fortress tower. But it was the wings that halted Robert's breath. They were wrong, Jack. The word cracked in his throat, dry and brittle. Robert did not turn his head. He kept his gaze pinned to the anomaly, afraid that if he blinked, the monster would submerge and vanish into the grain. Simmons sighed, the sound of air escaping a punctured tire. The casters of his chair shrieked across the linoleum as he slid closer. Tell me you found a missile silo in Cuba, Simmons muttered, leaning over the table. I need a win to justify this ulcer. Sector 4. Grid 7. Robert tapped the glass with a manicured fingernail. Simmons adjusted his own loop. He squinted against the rising smoke of his cigarette. For a long moment, the only sound in the bunker was the hum of the ventilation and the distant scratching of a grease pencil from another station. The cynicism drained from Simmons's face. His jaw tightened. The cigarette hung forgotten from his lip, the ash growing precariously long. What in God's name is that? Simmons whispered. I don't have a classification. Robert felt a cold prickle of sweat manifest at the base of his neck. Sitting in open water. But look at the displacement. Robert adjusted the focus, dialing in on the waterline. If the object were a ship, a vessel of that obvious tonnage, it would sit heavy in the water. The hull would displace thousands of cubic feet of liquid sinking deep. But this thing rode high. Too high. It sat on the surface like a water strider, defying the pull of the ocean. Maybe a barge? Simmons suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Pontoon transport? Look at the wake, Robert commanded. He scrolled the film forward 2 frames. The object was moving. The blur on the film indicated high velocity. Physics, Robert said, his voice dropping to a flat monotone. A displacement hull moving through water creates a Kelvin wake. A V-shape, turbulence, foam. You drag a ship through the sea fights back. He pointed to the water behind the monolith. It was smooth. There was no churning white water. No V-shaped scar trailing behind it. There was only a disturbed ripple, a chaotic smearing of the surface similar to what a low-flying jet might cause with its exhaust. No wake, Simmons breathed. It's not in the water. It's flying, Robert said. The conclusion tasted like ash. With those wings? Simmons scoffed, gesturing to the stubby protrusions jutting from the fuselage. Christ, Bob. Look at the aspect ratio. Those are clipped. Square. You couldn't get a Cessna off the ground with those, let alone something that size. It's an aerodynamic brick. Robert grabbed a red grease pencil. His hand trembled, a microscopic vibration he quelled by pressing his palm against the table. He reached for the mensuration kit, a set of transparent scales and reticles used to translate shadows and pixels into meters and feet. Let's measure it, Robert said. He laid the scale over the fuselage. He aligned the hash marks with the nose and the tail. He checked the sun angle to calculate the obliquity. He ran the numbers once. He stopped. He wiped the grease pencil mark away and ran them again. The math was indifferent to his fear. The math did not care about politics. Simply was. 92 meters, Robert said. Simmons coughed. A harsh, barking sound. Check your scale. I checked it twice. Robert stared at the number he had scrawled on his notepad. It's longer than a football field. It's 3 times the size of a B-52. A 90-meter aircraft? Simmons shook his head, retreating behind a wall of denial. Impossible. Structural failure would snap the spine on takeoff. The engines required to lift that, you'd need a nuclear reactor. Count the engines, Robert said. They leaned in together, clustered near the nose of the beast, mounted on a canard wing like a grotesque necklace, were pods. 1, 2, 3. Simmons counted, his voice losing volume with each digit. 8, plus 2 on the tail. 10. 10 jet engines. Robert felt the walls of the bunker closing in. The air suddenly felt too thin to support life. This was the false negative. This was the thing he had missed while he was looking for tanks and submarines. The Soviets had built a Leviathan. Robert adjusted the light intensity, dimming the glare to catch the subtle contrast of the shadow. This was the definitive test. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the Caspian waves. He found the shadow of the beast. It lay on the water, dark and sharp. But it was detached. There was a gap, a sliver of light between the dark belly of the machine and its shadow on the surface. It's not floating, Robert said, the realization settling in his gut like lead. And it's not flying. Not really. Ground effect, Simmons murmured. The cigarette ash finally fell, scattering gray dust over his suit. Wing-in ground effect. They're riding the cushion, trapping a bubble of air between the wing and the water. It's a chimera, Robert said. It stays below radar. It moves faster than any ship. And it's carrying. He squinted at the dorsal tubes mounted along the spine of the craft. Missile tubes. 6 of them. The implications cascaded through Robert's mind, a domino effect of tactical nightmares. A vessel that moved at 500 kilometers an hour. Invisible to sonar because it wasn't in the water. Invisible to radar because it hugged the curvature of the Earth. Armed with anti-ship missiles. If they build a fleet of these, Robert said, the Atlantic is gone. They could swarm a carrier battle group before the admiral finishes his coffee. The room seemed to tilt. The silence of the bunker was no longer pressurized. It was screaming. Robert looked around the analysis floor. Other men were hunched over their tables, sipping coffee, making jokes, complaining about the air conditioning. They did not know. The world above was driving to work, listening to the radio, worrying about mortgages. They did not know that the parameters of their survival had just been rewritten in a dark room by 2 men staring at a piece of plastic. The fear was cold and sharp. It wasn't the adrenaline rush of combat. It was the hollow, nausea-inducing dread of the actuary who realizes the insurance policy has expired. We need to flag this, Simmons said, reaching for the secure phone. His hand hovered over the receiver. What do we call it? The Pentagon is going to want a name. Robert looked at the image. The gray shape dominated the sea, an apex predator in a pond of minnows. It was ugly. It was terrifying. It was a monster. He picked up the red grease pencil again. With a heavy, deliberate hand, he circled the anomaly. The red wax was a wound on the black and white world. KM. Robert read the Cyrillic letters painted faintly on the tail. Korabel Macket. Prototype ship. That's not a ship, Bob, Simmons said. No, Robert agreed. He stared into the grain, into the pixelated soul of the Soviet Union. It's a monster, the Caspian Monster. Robert dropped the pencil. It rolled across the table, coming to rest against the edge of the light, framing the beast in a red border. The Cold War had just changed temperature. The ice was cracking. He sat back in his chair, the analyst's stoop aching, and waited for the phone to ring. He waited for the panic to start. The Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau in Gorky smelled of graphite, damp wool, and the relentless, grinding ambition of the Soviet Union. Sunlight fought a losing battle against the grime on the high factory windows, filtering down in weak, dusty shafts that illuminated the floating motes of sawdust like suspended stars. Rostislav Alexeyev stood before a drafting table the size of a billiard, his broad shoulders blocking the view of the junior engineers huddled behind him. He did not wear the gray suit of a bureaucrat. He wore a heavy naval turtleneck, the wool scratching against a neck weathered by the salt spray of the Volga and the Caspian. His hands, stained with ink and grease, rested flat on the blue paper, claiming the territory. Friction, Alexeyev boomed. His voice resonated off the steel beams of the ceiling, a baritone instrument tuned for shouting over roaring engines. It is a thief. It steals our fuel. It steals our speed. It steals our future. He turned to face the room. His steel-gray eyes, possessing the unsettling, far-sighted focus of a man watching a horizon no one else could see, swept over the assembly. We build ships. We push steel through water. But water is stupid. He grabbed a heavy metal ruler and slapped it against his palm. Water is 800 times denser than air. Think of it. We spend millions of rubles building engines to churn through glue. We fight the sea, and the sea fights, holding us down, dragging on the hull, demanding attacks on every meter we move forward. Dmitry Kogan, a young lieutenant with the fresh face of a Komsomol poster boy and a mouth constantly working a stick of chewing gum, raised a hand tentatively. He lowered it as Alexeyev's gaze landed on him. Speak, Dmitry, Alexeyev commanded. Comrade Chief Designer, Dmitry started, his voice quiet, respectful. The solution is aviation. We fly over the water. We escape the density. Alexeyev shook his head, a violent motion that tossed his silver-gray hair. Aviation is a coward's escape. To fly high, you must fight gravity. You need massive wings to grip the thin air. You need fuel to climb. You trade the tyranny of water for the tyranny of gravity. No. He turned to the blackboard behind him. With a piece of chalk, he drew a jagged line for the waves and a sleek, aggressive curve above it. We do not sail. We do not fly. We glide. He tapped the chalk against the board, creating a cloud of white dust. The forbidden zone. The space where the sailor is terrified of crashing and the pilot is terrified of drowning. This is where we will live. Right on the skin of the ocean. Alexeyev sketched a bird. A heavy albatross, wings locked, skimming millimeters above the swell. The ground effect, he declared. Pilots fear it. They call it the cushion. When they land, the air gets trapped between the wing and the runway. Pushes up. It refuses to get out of the way. It makes the plane float when they want it to settle. They fight it. He drew a thick arrow pointing up from the water to the bird's wing. We will not fight it. We will ride it. We will compress the atmosphere into a solid foundation. We will turn the air into a dynamic mattress. The room remained silent, save for the scratching of pens. The engineers understood the theory, but the application frightened them. To rely on ground effect meant abandoning the safety of altitude. It meant flying a building at the speed of a jet, close enough to the water to see the foam on the waves. Alexeyev returned to the blueprints. He unrolled a fresh sheet, revealing the profile of a monster. The KM, he said, Korabel maquette. The drawing depicted a leviathan, 92 meters of aluminum and steel. It possessed the predatory snout of a shark and a tail that rose like a monument to hubris. But the wings drew the eye. They were not the graceful, tapering wings of a Tupolev bomber. They were brutal, short, square, clipped. The Americans will look at these wings and laugh, Alexeyev said, a wry grin cracking his weathered face. They will say, "This brick cannot fly." And they will be right. It does not fly. Traps. He traced the outline of the stubby wing. These are not wings. They are trapdoors. We cup the air. We prevent it from leaking out the sides. We force the atmosphere to do the work. We sit on a column of high pressure. We cheat friction. Dmitri stepped forward, mesmerized by the sheer scale of the drawing. 500 tons, Rostislav Evgenievich? You intend to lift 500 tons with stubby wings? I intend to lift 500 tons with fire, Alexeyev corrected. Caspian Naval Testing Base. The edge of the world. The sky hung low and heavy, a leaden sheet of gray dissolving into the horizon line of the Caspian Sea. There were no shadows here, only a flat, desaturated wash of cold light. The air tasted of brine, rotten seaweed, and the sharp, chemical sting of kerosene. The pier stretched out into the water like a concrete finger pointing an accusation at the west. At the end of it, moored in the deep water, the KM waited. In the flesh, the machine was terrifying. It loomed over the chase boats, a gray mountain range of riveted metal. The red star on the tail fin seemed small, insignificant against the vast expanse of the vertical stabilizer. Alexeyev stood on the wet concrete, the wind whipping his leather flight jacket. He watched the fueling crews scurry over the fuselage like ants on a carcass. They dragged thick black hoses, feeding the beast its liquid diet. "Check the igniters," Alexeyev barked into a handheld radio. "I want a clean start. No coughing." High above, in the cockpit, Major Yuri Volkov gave a thumbs up. The pilot looked small behind the glass, a prisoner in a high-speed cell. "Clear the area," Dmitri shouted, waving his arms at a group of sailors loitering near the bollards. "Unless you want your eardrums blown out the side of your head. Move." The preparation for startup was not a mechanical procedure. It was an act of violence. The KM did not rely on aerodynamics alone to lift its bulk. It needed help. It needed power augmentation. Mounted on the forward canard, angled slightly downward like the barrels of a Gatling gun, were the engines. Not 2, not 4, 10. 10 Dobrynin VD-7 turbojet engines. The same power plants used to push strategic bombers through the stratosphere. Here they were chained together, aimed at the water. "Initiate sequence," Alexeyev ordered. The first engine whined, a high-pitched shriek that ascended rapidly into a dog whistle range. Then came the second, the third. The sound layered upon itself, building a harmonic dissonance that vibrated the fillings in Alexeyev's teeth. When the combustion chambers ignited, the world ceased to exist as an auditory experience. It became physical. The roar hit the chest like a sledgehammer. It wasn't noise. It was pressure. 10 pillars of fire erupted from the exhaust nozzles. The heat distorted the air, turning the gray horizon into a shimmering mirage. The jet blast slammed into the water, churning the surface into a boiling cauldron of steam and spray. This was the secret. The engines didn't just push the craft forward. They blasted air directly under the wings. They created the cushion before the craft even moved. It was a volcanic eruption harnessed for lift. Alexeyev watched with a fierce, possessive pride. The ground shook beneath his boots. The concrete pier trembled. This was power. This was the Soviet Union made manifest, subtlety abandoned for sheer, overwhelming force. He signaled to the chase boat, "Let's go. I want eyes on the hull separation." The chase boat, a sleek hydrofoil in its own right, tore across the water, struggling to keep pace as the KM began its taxi run. Alexeyev stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the lenses, the monster occupied the entire world. "Throttles to 80%. Alexeyev shouted over the radio, though he doubted Yuri could hear him over the screaming of the 10 turbojets. The KM accelerated. The water fought it. The drag was visible, a physical hand grabbing the hull. The Caspian Sea did not want to let go. White foam churned around the nose, waves smashing against the aluminum skin. The fuselage shuddered, a metal beast shivering in the cold. "Come on," Alexeyev whispered, his knuckles white on the binoculars. Break it. The speed climbed. 200 kilometers per hour. The vibration was catastrophic. On the bridge of the chase boat, Dmitri held onto the railing, his face pale. It's going to shake apart. The rivets won't hold. It holds. Alexeyev roared. Physics holds. At 300 kilometers per hour, the miracle occurred. The nose lifted. It wasn't a graceful takeoff. It was a violent rejection of the water. The KM popped free. The hiss of the hull cutting the waves vanished, replaced instantly by the hollow roar of wind. The spray settled. The white water disappeared. The KM leveled out. It hung there, suspended 3 meters above the surface. A 500-ton steel building floating on an invisible pillow. Throttle back cruise engines. Yuri's voice crackled over the radio, transitioning to the screen. The forward engines spooled down, their job done. The massive tail thrusters took over. Now the movement changed. The violence evaporated. The KM didn't bounce. It glided. It moved with a supernatural smoothness, a ghost sliding across a mirror. It was on the screen. Alexeyev lowered the binoculars. A grin split his face, wild and triumphant. Look at her, he said to Dmitri. She is not fighting the water. She is ignoring it. From the chase boat, the sight was impossible. The massive craft moved faster than any ship in human history, yet it left almost no wake. The water behind it was merely rippled, brushed by the passing pressure of the air cushion. It was a phantom. Speed? Alexeyev asked. 450, the radio operator reported. 480. 500 kilometers per hour. 500. A ship that moved at the speed of a World War II fighter plane. But inside the cockpit, the reality was less poetic. Major Yuri Volkov gripped the yoke, his gloves slick with sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the hum of the gyroscopes. The view out the windscreen was a blurring nightmare of gray water rushing past at dizzying speed. Altitude 3 meters, the navigator called out, his voice trembling. Holding 3 meters. Yuri knew the math. At this speed, 3 meters was not a height. It was a rounding error. He felt the razor's edge Alexeyev spoke of. It was a physical sensation in the controls. The air cushion was stiff, resisting his inputs. It wanted to push the nose up. But if he let it, if he climbed out of the ground effect zone, the lift would vanish. The cushion would vent out the sides and 500 tons of metal would drop. And below, he glanced down. The water was a concrete wall waiting to happen. If a wingtip dipped, if they hit a rogue wave, the disintegration would be instantaneous. There would be no wreckage to recover, only confetti. Correction, Yuri snapped, making a micro-adjustment to the yoke. Keep it flat. Don't let her climb. He was a pilot trained to seek the safety of the sky. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to pull back, to soar up into the clouds away from the deadly water. But he had to suppress it. He had to force the nose down. He had to fly against his own survival instinct. Back on the chase boat, the distance compressed the danger into beauty. Alexeyev saw only the triumph. It works, he murmured. It changes everything. Dmitri watched the KM bank gently. A slow, majestic turn that spanned kilometers. The Americans, he said, chewing his gum furiously. They will think it is a weapon. An invasion craft. Let them, Alexeyev scoffed. He turned his back to the wind, lighting a cigarette with cupped hands. They see a sword. I see a bridge. He gestured to the horizon. Imagine Dmitri, not just soldiers, passengers, cargo. A fleet of these giants connecting Baku to Astrakhan, Vladivostok to Sakhalin. No runways to build. No deep water ports to dredge. The ocean is the highway, and we have paved it with air. The vision consumed him. He saw a future where the oceans were tamed, where the friction of the world was conquered by Soviet engineering. He saw the KM not as a singular freak of nature, but as the grandfather of a new species. It carries the payload of a ship at the speed of a plane, Alexeyev said, smoke mingling with the salt spray. It is the ultimate efficiency. But the pilots, Dmitry ventured, watching the distant speck of the KM struggling with a patch of turbulence. It demands perfection. Alexeyev's eyes narrowed. He looked at the machine, currently fighting to maintain its precarious balance between the sea and the sky. Progress always demands perfection, Alexeyev said, his voice hardening. The machine is perfect. It obeys the laws of physics. He watched the KM dip slightly, a spray of water kissing the hull before it corrected. The machine is loyal, Alexeyev whispered, the first note of doubt creeping into his tone. It is the men who are the variable. He knew, deep down in the cold logic of his engineer's heart, that the margin was too thin. Plane could stall and recover. A ship could run aground and be towed. The Ekranoplan had no recovery mode. It existed in a binary state, flying perfectly or destroyed. Bring them in, Alexeyev ordered, the joy suddenly drained from the moment. The wind is picking up. We are tempting fate. As the KM turned for its final run, the roar of its engines echoing across the empty sea, it looked less like the future and more like a tragedy waiting for a timestamp. The gray beast skimmed the gray water, a prisoner of the narrow gap where it was allowed to exist, trapped between the crushing weight of gravity and the unforgiving hardness of the sea. Alexeyev watched it come. He had conquered friction. He had cheated nature. But as the salt spray hit his face, he wondered if nature was merely waiting to collect the debt. The city of Gorky did not dream of the ocean. It dreamt of steel. Closed off from the world, a fortress of industry locked deep within the Soviet interior, it existed in a perpetual state of gray soot and grinding machinery. Here, the Volga River was not a body of water but a conveyor belt for barges, a sluggish artery clogged with the cholesterol of empire. Rostislav Alexeyev stood at the window of his office in the Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau, watching the snowfall on the shipyard below. It was 1966. To the east, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the frantic energy of the space race consumed the national budget. Every kopeck, every liter of rocket fuel, every ounce of titanium was funneled upward, dedicated to the conquest of the vacuum. The party leaders spoke only of altitude. They wanted to touch the moon. Alexeyev turned from the window. He despised the vertical. They look up, he muttered to the empty room, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. They ignore the friction right under their boots. He walked to the massive drafting table that dominated the center of the room. It was a landscape of blue paper and graphite, a battlefield where he fought his private war against hydrodynamics. While Korolev and the rocket men fought gravity, Alexeyev fought density. He picked up a slide rule, the plastic worm from hours of use. The numbers did not lie. A ship, no matter how streamlined, spent 80% of its energy simply pushing water out of the way. It was an equation of waste. The door opened. Dmitry Kogan entered, brushing snow from the shoulders of his wool coat. The young lieutenant carried a thermos of tea and a roll of fresh schematics. His face flushed with the biting cold of the Gorky winter. The wind tunnel results, Rostislav Evgenevich, Dmitry said, placing the papers on the table. The drag coefficient is still too high on the hull step. Alexeyev unrolled the paper, weighing the corners down with heavy brass inkwells. He traced the curve of the hull with a grease-stained finger. The water grabs it, Alexeyev said. It is sticky. We are trying to run through molasses. He looked at Dmitry. The boy had the sharp, eager eyes of a believer, but he was still tethered to traditional naval architecture. Gather the senior engineers, Alexeyev ordered. The hull is not the problem. The water is the problem. We stop fighting it today. The briefing room smelled of damp wool and stale tobacco. Dust motes danced in the harsh light of the overhead bulbs. 20 men, the finest hydrodynamic minds in the Soviet Union, sat in silence as Alexeyev stood before the chalkboard. He did not speak immediately. He drew a horizontal line. The sea, he said. He drew a second line, jagged and chaotic, above it. The sky. He turned to the room, the chalk crumbling in his grip. Between these two domains lies the forbidden zone. The height of a wave. The span of a gull's wing. The sailor fears it because it means he is sinking. The pilot fears it because it means he is crashing. But nature uses it. He sketched a seabird, an albatross, its wings locked in a rigid glide inches above the swell. Why does the bird not flap? Alexeyev asked. Is it lazy? No, it is efficient. He drew arrows curling under the bird's wing. The ground effect. When a wing moves close to a surface, the air cannot escape. It becomes trapped, compressed. The pressure rises. The bird rests on a cushion of air. It does not fly, it rides. He slammed his hand against the board, a cloud of chalk dust erupting. We will build a machine that does this. We will not float. We will not soar. We will compress the atmosphere into a dynamic mattress and slide across the Caspian like a puck on ice. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older aerodynamicists, a man named Volkov who had worked on Tupolev bombers, cleared his throat. Rostislav Alexeyev, the instability at that altitude, the pitch moment shifts violently. If the nose rises 1 degree too high, the cushion vents. We lose lift. We crash. Then we design it to trap the air, Alexeyev countered. He went to the drafting table and unveiled the main schematic. It was the KM. The silence in the room deepened. The drawing depicted a chimera, a monster that violated every convention of engineering. It was 92 meters long, the length of a football field. The fuselage was heavy, reinforced like a battleship, designed to endure the pounding of the sea. But the wings caused the most confusion. They are clipped, Volkov whispered. They are stumps. They are fences, Alexeyev corrected. We do not need aspect ratio for high-altitude gliding. We need to cup the air. These short, square wings capture the pressure bubble. They force the air under the belly. He pointed to the nose of the craft. And here, he tapped the paper, is how we lift 540 tons. 500 tons? Volkov choked. The largest American transport plane carries a fraction of that. The Americans rely on suction from above, Alexeyev said. We rely on pressure from below. But to start the process, we need fire. He sketched the engine mounts on the forward canard. Power augmentation. We mount the engines here. 10 of them. Derbent VD7 turbojets. We angle the exhaust down. We blast the air under the wings. We create the cushion before we even move. It was madness. It was genius. It was an engineering chimera designed to inhabit the razor-thin margin between disaster and glory. Caspian Naval Testing Base, 1967. The KM sat in the water, a gray monolith against the leaden sky. In the flesh, the sheer scale of the machine reduced the men on the pier to insects. It was a cathedral of aluminum, riveting, and raw ambition. The Caspian Sea was choppy, the waves slapping against the concrete pilings with a rhythmic, wet thud. The air tasted of salt and the heavy, oily scent of kerosene. Alexeyev stood on the bridge of the chase boat, his binoculars trained on the cockpit. Inside the glass blister of the KM, he could see the helmeted heads of the test pilots, small specks in the forehead of the giant. Radio check, Alexeyev barked into the handset. Read you 5x5, chief designer, the pilot's voice crackled back, tight with adrenaline. Initiate start sequence. Engines 1 through 10. The sound began as a whine, a high-frequency drilling that pierced the eardrums. Then, as the fuel ignited in the combustion chambers, it deepened into a roar that was felt in the marrow of the bone rather than heard. One by one, the 10 Derbent engines screamed to life. The water around the nose of the KM erupted. The exhaust blast, directed downward, churned the sea into a boiling cauldron of white foam and steam. The entire pier shook. The chase boat vibrated, the coffee in Dmitri's cup rippling in concentric circles. Throttles forward, Alexeyev ordered. Release the beast. The KM surged. For the first 30 seconds, it was a war. The water fought back. At low speeds, the hull dragged through the dense liquid, the friction acting like a giant hand holding the machine back. The vibration was catastrophic. Rivets strained, panels rattled, and the pilots fought the yoke as the craft bucked over the chop. Speed 200, the radio blared. Drag is high. She wants to stick. Push through it. Alexeyev shouted, though no one could hear him over the apocalypse of the engines. More power. At 300 kilometers per hour, the physics shifted. The air cushion formed. The nose rose. The hull broke contact with the water. The violent shuddering vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, supernatural smoothness. The KM was airborne. It did not climb into the clouds. It leveled off at exactly 4 meters. It hovered there, suspended on an invisible layer of compressed air, sliding forward with the inevitability of a glacier but the speed of a fighter jet. Transition complete, the pilot reported, his voice noticeably calmer. We are on the screen. Alexeyev lowered his binoculars. He watched his creation accelerate away from the chase boat, leaving almost no wake. A ship of that size should have churned a tsunami behind it. The KM left only a ripple, a smudge on the surface where the air pressure had kissed the water. Look at the fuel flow, Dmitri said, pointing to the telemetry data streaming onto the chart recorder. Once she's on the cushion, look, it drops by 60%. Efficiency, Alexeyev whispered. We are moving a skyscraper at 500 kilometers an hour, and we are sipping fuel. The test flight continued for an hour, the KM tracing massive loops over the empty sea. But as the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, a new realization emerged. The radar operator on the shore station radioed the chase boat. Chase 1, this is base. We have lost contact with the target. Alexeyev frowned. Lost contact? She is right in front of you. 5 kilometers out. Negative, Chase 1. The scope is clear. We have sea clutter, waves, but no target. Alexeyev grabbed the microphone. Check your gain. It's a 90-meter metal object. How can you miss it? We are checking, comrade. But she is too low. She is below the horizon line. The radar sees only the waves. Alexeyev froze. He looked at Dmitri. A slow smile spread across the old engineer's face. They had built a transport. They had accidentally built a phantom. The radio waves go over its head, Alexeyev murmured. It hugs the curvature of the earth. Until it is right on top of you, it does not exist. He imagined a fleet of these monsters, loaded with tanks and marines, sprinting across the Black Sea or the Baltic. They would appear out of nowhere, under the radar, faster than any ship could react, delivering an army to the enemy's beach before the sirens even sounded. The military will love this, Dmitri said, his voice tinged with unease. The military ruins everything it touches, Alexeyev replied. But yes, they will love it. When the KM returned to the dock, towing a silence as heavy as its hull, the painting crew was already waiting. The secrecy was paramount. Satellites passed overhead daily, the unblinking eyes of the Americans in the stratosphere. Alexeyev walked to the tail of the craft. A painter with a bucket of white paint waited for instructions. What do we call her, comrade chief designer? Alexeyev patted the cold aluminum skin. It was still vibrating slightly, echoing the power of the flight. It is a prototype ship, Alexeyev said. Korabel maquette. KM. The painter nodded. He dipped his brush and began to scrawl the massive Cyrillic letters on the vertical stabilizer. K.M. Alexeyev watched the letters form. He knew the Americans would see these letters in their grainy satellite photos. They would wonder what they meant. Caspian Monster? Kirov model? They would invent names born of their own fear. They will call it a monster, Dmitri said, standing beside him. Let them, Alexeyev said. Fear is a form of respect. But as the months of testing turned into years, the thrill of the first flight curdled into a grinding tension. The KM was a demanding mistress. The physics of the ground effect were unforgiving. Alexeyev called it the razor's edge. To maintain the air cushion, the pilots had to fly within a specific altitude window, 3 to 4 meters. If the pilot pulled back on the stick and climbed to 10 meters, the air trapped under the wings would vent. The pressure bubble would burst. The KM, suddenly deprived of its invisible foundation, would become a 500-ton brick. It would stall and fall. If the pilot pushed forward, or if a rogue wave rose up, the nose would impact the water. At 500 kilometers per hour, water is as hard as concrete. The collision would shear the fuselage apart instantly. There was no autopilot. No computer could calculate the shifting variables of wave height and air pressure fast enough. It required the hands of a human. Alexeyev stood on the bridge of the chase boat day after day, watching the KM skim the waves. He saw the fatigue in the pilots' eyes when they climbed out of the cockpit. Their flight suits were soaked with sweat even in winter. Their hands shook when they lit cigarettes. The machine was perfect. It obeyed the laws of physics with absolute loyalty. But the men inside were biological, flawed, and tired. One afternoon, late in 1979, Alexeyev watched Major Yuri Volkov descend the ladder after a 6-hour endurance run. Volkov looked gray. He leaned against a stanchion, wiping his face with a rag. "She fights me, Rostislav," Volkov said quietly. "Every second. I have to correct for the wind, for the swell. Cannot blink. If I sneeze, we die." Alexeyev handed the pilot a flask of brandy. "You are taming the future, Yuri. It is wild." "It is not wild," Volkov said, taking a long pull. "It is unforgiving. Plane gives you time. If you stall at 10,000 meters, you have minutes to recover. Here, the 3 meters." He snapped his fingers. "Zero time." Alexeyev looked out at the KM bobbing gently in the harbor. The sun glinted off the cockpit glass, making it look like a skull. He had conquered friction. He had cheated drag. He had hidden from radar. But he had not solved the oldest problem in engineering, the human factor. The machine was faster than the man flying it. Alexeyev felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Caspian wind. He recognized the variable he could not calculate. He was playing Russian roulette with physics, and the chamber was slowly rotating toward the bullet. "We go again tomorrow," Alexeyev said, his voice hard. "We need data on the turning radius." Volkov nodded, the resignation of a soldier evident in his slump. "Tomorrow." Alexeyev watched him walk away. The KM waited in the water, a silent, gray predator, patient and hungry. It was a masterpiece of the Cold War, a technological marvel that required a sacrifice to function. Alexeyev feared that the ocean, denied its friction, would eventually demand its due in blood. The briefing room smelled of chalk dust and the sour, metallic tang of nervous sweat. It was a smell Robert Vance associated with failure. Overhead, the harsh strip lighting hummed a monotone dirge, washing out the skin tones of the men in the room until they resembled corpses waiting for an autopsy. Robert stood before the wall-sized tactical map. In his hand, a black marker hovered over the glossy surface of the Atlantic Ocean. He pressed the felt tip against the board. The squeak of the marker was violence in the silence. He drew a long, gentle curve. The Earth. He drew a straight line tangentially from the surface. The radar beam of a Belknap-class destroyer. "Geometry," Robert said. His voice was flat, stripped of inflection, a tool for delivering bad news. "It is not a matter of technology. It is a matter of curvature." He marked a small, jagged X in the wedge of empty space between the curve of the ocean and the straight line of the radar beam. "The radar horizon," he continued. "For a standard surface search radar mounted at mast height, the line of sight extends roughly 12 to 15 nautical miles against a sea-skimming target. But the Soviet craft, the KM, it does not fly at altitude. It operates here." He tapped the X. 3 meters. It hugs the skin of the ocean. It hides in the clutter of the waves. Jack Simmons sat at the metal table, a cloud of cigarette smoke acting as his personal atmosphere. He flipped open a file folder, the heavy cardstock landing with a dull thud. Functionally invisible, Simmons rasped. "To the electronic eyes of the Sixth Fleet, the ocean is empty. The radar sweep sees only water, whitecaps, noise. By the time the signal separates the target from the background noise, the target is already inside the defensive perimeter." Robert capped the marker. The fumes made him lightheaded. "It is a blind spot, a permanent geometric shadow where a 90-meter Leviathan can hide." Simmons pushed a second folder across the table. It slid over the polished surface, stopping at the edge. It gets worse. Robert picked up the file. Hydroacoustic data. We ran the profiles against every known signature in the library. Simmons said, ash falling unnoticed onto his lapel. Submarines listen for cavitation. They listen for the screw churning the water, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a propeller blade slicing through the density. Simmons pointed a stained finger at the file. This thing does not touch the water. The hull rides on a cushion of air. There is no screw, no rudder, no water displacement. To a Los Angeles-class attack boat patrolling the thermocline, the KM is a ghost. It makes no sound because it has no footprint. Robert stared at the acoustic graphs. Flat lines. The ocean was full of noise, whales, shifting tectonic plates, distant shipping lanes. But this monster moved through the void in total silence. It existed in the sensor gap, the terrifying slice of physics where American ears were deaf and American eyes were blind. We have a target we cannot see and cannot hear, Robert summarized. He walked to the tactical computer console in the corner of the room. The green monochrome monitor glowed with a hypnotic, radioactive malice. Let's discuss the physics of the intercept. He punched in the velocity variables. Standard cruising speed for AUS carrier battle group, Robert typed. 30 knots. Maximum flank speed, perhaps 33 knots on a good day. He entered the second variable. Estimated cruising speed of the KM based on the engine output and drag coefficients. He hit the enter key. The number 270 knots flashed on the screen. 300 miles per hour, Robert said. 500 kilometers per hour. It moves 10 times faster than the target it is hunting. He initiated the simulation. On the screen, a blue square represented the USS Nimitz. A red diamond represented the KM. The red diamond did not crawl. It sprinted. The distance closed with a rapidity that made the stomach turn. Reaction time, Robert said, watching the green pixels collide. In a standard engagement with a subsonic Soviet bomber or a surface ship, the admiral has hours. He launches the combat air patrol. He positions the destroyers. He has time to drink a coffee and consult the rules of engagement. The red diamond overlapped the blue square. The screen blinked. Contact. Here, Robert said, pointing to the timestamps. The window is 6 minutes. From the moment the KM pops over the radar horizon to the moment of impact. 6 minutes. You cannot scramble an F-14 in 6 minutes. You cannot turn a carrier into the wind in 6 minutes. Simmons crushed his cigarette into the overflowing ashtray. It's a sniper in a crowded room. You don't know he's there until the bullet is already in the air. Robert moved back to the light table. The large reconnaissance photo of the Caspian Monster lay spread out, held down by heavy brass weights. He picked up his magnifying loupe. We need to identify the claws, he said. He leaned over the dorsal spine of the craft. The grain of the film was heavy, but the shapes were distinct. Slanted tubes, cylindrical housings angled forward, aggressive and aerodynamic. Not air intakes, Robert muttered. Launch tubes. See the diameter? Too wide for exhaust. Too narrow for crew access. He cross-referenced the dimensions with the Office of Naval Intelligence Threat Catalog. P-270, Robert said. The code name tasted like copper. Moskit. Simmons nodded grimly. NATO designation. Sunburn. A ramjet-powered cruise missile, Robert recited from memory. Mach 3. It schemes the water at 10 meters altitude. Designed specifically to penetrate the Aegis defense system. 6 of them, Simmons added. 6 tubes on the back of the beast. 1 km carries enough ordnance to sink a task force. The silence in the room changed quality. It shifted from the tension of a puzzle to the dread of a verdict. Escalation, Robert said. The Moskit is dual-capable. Conventional or nuclear, Simmons confirmed. 200 kiloton yield. Or a 400-kilogram high-explosive warhead. Robert stood up straight, his spine cracking audibly. This lowers the threshold. If a Soviet commander is sitting in that cockpit, flying at 300 knots, invisible to the world, and he sees an American carrier, The temptation for a decapitation strike becomes overwhelming. It is not a skirmish tool. It is a doomsday trigger. Even without the nuke, Simmons said, pulling a fresh pack of cigarettes from his pocket. Let's do the math on the kinetic energy. Kinetic kill, Robert agreed. A 4-ton missile, Simmons calculated aloud, his voice raspy, hitting a stationary steel hull at 3,000 kilometers per hour. E equals 1/2 mv squared. Simmons paused, letting the physics hang in the air. Doesn't need to explode, Bob. The impact alone would punch a hole through the Enterprise from bow to stern. The shockwave would liquefy the crew. It's a kinetic sledgehammer. Robert turned back to the whiteboard. He erased the simple curve of the Earth. He began to draw arrows. Not one, dozens. The swarm, he said. He drew a central circle, the target. Then he drew vectors converging from every point on the compass. We are assuming a single unit, Robert said. But the Soviets do not build single units. They build armies. Imagine a squadron. 12K MiS. 72 Moskit missiles. He tapped the board aggressively. They approach from 360 degrees. They sit below the radar until the final sprint. Then, at 10 miles out, they pop up and fire. Saturation, Simmons said. The phalanx CIWS can track. What? 2 targets? 3? If you have 70 missiles inbound at Mach 3, the computer chokes. The defense grid is overwhelmed. The math is simple. The fleet burns. Robert stared at the diagram. It was a spiderweb of death. First strike, Robert wrote on the board. He underlined it twice. The marker tip spread under the pressure, bleeding into the white surface. This is not a defensive weapon. You don't build this to protect a coastline. You build this to erase an enemy before they wake up. Surprise is the only currency that matters, Simmons said. In 1941, we lost the fleet because we were looking the wrong way. This time, we are looking the right way, but we are looking too high. Robert paced the length of the small room. The linoleum squeaked under his shoes. The cost, he said. Think about the asymmetry. He gestured to the briefing materials scattered on the table. How much does a Nimitz-class carrier cost? Billions. How much does it cost to train the 5,000 men on board? Billions more. And to defend it against this. He pointed to the photo of the KM. Aluminum. Jet engines from a bomber warehouse. No complex reactor. No underwater pressure hull. It is cheap. Brutally, wonderfully cheap. We spend $1 billion to build a target, Simmons said. They spend $1 million to build a bullet. To counter this, Robert continued, we would need to refit every ship in the Navy. Look down radar. Constant AWACS patrols. 24-hour air cover. The logistics alone would bleed the treasury dry. It's an economic weapon, Simmons agreed. They don't have to fight us. They just have to force us to spend ourselves into bankruptcy trying to stop it. Robert stopped pacing. He looked at the photo again. The gray monster. The clipped wings. The sheer ugliness of it. And the terror, Robert said softly. The psychology of it. It's ugly, Simmons grunted. It's alien, Robert corrected. Imagine you are an 18-year-old sailor on watch. You are looking for ships. You are looking for planes. And then, this comes out of the mist. It defies categorization. It flies, but it is not a plane. It floats, but it is not a ship. Technological shock, Simmons said. Like the tank in 1916. Or the atom bomb in 45. It tells the soldier, the enemy has mastered laws of nature that you do not understand. It breaks the will. Robert felt the weight of the burden. The watchman's burden. He had found the needle in the haystack, but the needle was poisoned. Is there an out? Robert asked. Is there a flaw? Simmons exhaled a plume of smoke, squinting through the haze. He picked up a technical engineering assessment report, a thick document filled with stress analysis and fluid dynamics equations. Complexity, Simmons said. That's the white knight. He flipped to a page detailing the engine configuration. 10 engines, Bob. 10. Do you know the maintenance hours required to keep 10 turbojets synchronized? And the salt. They are flying jet engines through salt spray. The corrosion will be a nightmare. Simmons tapped the page. And the pilot workload. No autopilot. They have to fly it manually 3 meters off the water at 300 knots. One sneeze, one twitch, and they hit a wave. It requires perfection. The Soviets are not known for perfection, Robert noted. They are known for durability. But this isn't a T-34 tank, Simmons argued. This is a Stradivarius made of aluminum. It's high-strung. It's a diva. If one hydraulic line bursts, if one flap sticks, the monster becomes a coffin. So our defense strategy is, hope? Robert asked. Hope that it breaks? Hope that it kills its masters before it kills us, Simmons corrected. It's a fragile beast. Robert looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12. Time was leaking away. We cannot bank on rust, Robert said. Intelligence indicates they are entering the final testing phase. If they solve the corrosion issues, if they automate the flight controls. Mid-1980s, Simmons predicted. Operational fleet capability. 5 years, Robert said. We have 5 years to invent a shield against a sword we can't see. He picked up the red stamp from the tray. He pressed it onto the cover of the report. Flash priority. The red ink looked like blood against the manila folder. The clock starts now, Robert said. Washington needs to wake up. The ocean is no longer a moat. It is a highway. Simmons stood, gathering his files. The cigarette burned down to the filter, scorching his fingers. He didn't flinch. The arms race just changed lanes, Simmons said. It's not about who has the biggest bomb anymore. It's about who owns the space between the waves. Robert turned off the tactical computer. The green glow faded, plunging the corner of the room into shadow. But the image of the red diamond sprinting across the screen burned on his retina. The monster was coming, and for the first time in his career, Robert Vance was not sure the West could stop it. The Caspian Sea had ceased to be water. Under the oppressive, monolithic gray of the 1980 sky, the horizon dissolved. There was no seam between the ocean and the clouds, only a seamless, suffocating sphere of lead. Rostislav Alexeyev stood on the bridge of the chaseboat, the collar of his leather jacket turned up against the biting damp. He gripped the cold railing, his knuckles white, matching the frost on the metal. Through the lenses of his high-powered binoculars, the world was magnified and shaky. He focused on the machine. The KM sat low in the swell, engines idling, spitting heat haze into the freezing air. It looked old. 15 years of secret trials had scoured the paint from its aluminum skin, leaving it scarred by salt, sand, and the friction of the atmosphere. Streaks of oil stained the fuselage like bruises. The red star on the tail was faded, peeling at the edges, a symbol of an empire that was itself beginning to rust. Wind speed 12 meters per second, the radio operator called out, his voice tinny and distorted by the static of the gathering storm. Chop is moderate. Alexeyev did not lower the binoculars. A heaviness settled in his chest, a grim resonance with the weather. The design bureau was bleeding money. The party officials in Moscow grew impatient, their promises of funding drying up like the Aral Sea. Every test run now carried the weight of a final verdict. Proceed, Alexeyev whispered. He pressed the transmit button. Clear for takeoff run. Watch the pitch, Yuri. The sea is angry today. Inside the cockpit of the KM, the air smelled of stale sweat, heated rubber, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Major Yuri Volkov sat strapped into the pilot's seat, a prisoner of his own expertise. He adjusted his gloves, pulling the leather tight over his knuckles. He checked the analog gauges, a wall of dials vibrating slightly from the idle thrust of the 10 Dobrynin engines mounted on the forward canard. Yuri was a man of the stratosphere. He had spent his career in the cockpits of Tupolev Tu-95 bombers, lumbering giants designed to patrol the thin air at 40,000 feet. His body remembered the sky. His instincts were calibrated for altitude, for the safety of open space where a stall meant a gentle nose-down correction, a loss of a few hundred feet, and a recovery. He was a creature of the vertical trying to tame a creature of the horizontal. Engines to full power, Yuri ordered. His voice was clipped, a military habit used to mask the tremor of adrenaline. Full power, the co-pilot repeated, his hand pushing the bank of 10 throttle levers forward. The response was instantaneous and violent. The KM screamed. It was not the clean whine of a modern jet. It was a dirty, harmonic roar that rattled the teeth in Yuri's skull. The fuselage shuddered, groaning under the torture of the thrust. Yuri gripped the yoke. The vibration traveled up his arms, shaking his shoulders. The beast lunged. The acceleration pinned Yuri against his seat. Outside the reinforced glass, the gray water blurred into streaks of motion. The hull hammered against the wave tops. Thud, thud, thud. A jackhammer rhythm that blurred his vision. He watched the airspeed indicator climb. 100, 200. The drag was a physical hand holding them back, the water clinging to the aluminum skin. Yuri fought the urge to pull back early. He had to wait. He had to let the speed build until the physics took over. Rotate, he snapped. He applied a gentle pressure to the column. The hammering ceased. The silence was sudden and terrifying. The KM popped free of the surface, severing its bond with the friction of the sea. The vibration vanished, replaced by the smooth, eerie glide of the ground effect. They were airborne. Altitude 3 meters, the navigator called out. Speed 400. 450. Yuri scanned the instruments. The horizon was gone, lost in the mist. He was flying by instrument references alone, suspended on an invisible cushion of air, racing at 300 miles per hour down a corridor of death with a ceiling of 4 meters and a floor of concrete hard water. He felt the instability. The KM was twitchy today. The air cushion was not a solid foundation. It was a living thing, shifting and pulsing beneath the wings, reacting to the uneven surface of the waves below. Correcting for drift, Yuri muttered, dipping the left wing slightly. The machine resisted. It wanted to yaw. The sweat running down his spine turned cold. He was flying a building through a fog bank, and the building was fighting him. On the chase boat, Alexeyev watched the spray wake of the monster. It was a phantom, a gray blur dissolving into the gray mist. She is pitching up, Dmitry Kogan said, standing beside him. The young engineer chewed his gum furiously, a metronome of anxiety. Look at the angle of attack. Alexeyev frowned. He saw it too. The nose of the KM was hunting, bobbing slightly as it sought the sweet spot of the cushion. Steady, Yuri, Alexeyev murmured to the wind. Don't fight her. Let her ride. He knew the danger, the razor's edge. The ground effect worked by trapping air. If the nose went too low, the crash was instant. If the nose went too high, he's climbing, Dmitry said, his voice rising in pitch. He's climbing too fast. A rogue wave, perhaps a meter higher than the rest, rolled beneath the fuselage. The disruption in the surface geometry rippled upward, compressing the air cushion violently. The KM bucked. The nose pitched down sharply, the windscreen filling with the dark, churning water. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Yuri's brain. In that split second, the training of 20 years took over. The logic of the Ekranoplan to make small, counterintuitive corrections evaporated. The muscle memory of the bomber pilot asserted control. Danger. Ground approaching. Pull up. It was a reflex wired into his neurons. It was the survival instinct of a bird. Yuri hauled the yoke back into his stomach. He screamed the command. Climb. The controls responded. The elevators on the massive tail bit into the airstream. The nose of the 90-meter Leviathan rose aggressively, pointing toward the salvation of the clouds. It was the correct maneuver for a plane. It was a death sentence for the KM. The angle of attack steepened. 10 degrees. 15 degrees. The trapdoor opened. The KM relied on its stubby, downturned wings to cup the air, to hold the high-pressure bubble against the water. As the nose rose, the trailing edge of the wings lifted away from the surface. The seal broke. The dynamic air mattress, the 500 tons of lift that supported the steel carcass, vented out the back in a rush of turbulent wind. The pressure dropped to zero. No! The co-pilot screamed, realizing the physics before the sensation hit. The KM ceased to be a flying machine. It became a falling brick. Gravity, cheated for 15 years by Alexeyev's genius, reclaimed its debt with compound interest. The lift vanished. The nose was pointed up, but the machine was no longer flying. It was stalling. The tail section, massive and heavy, hung low in the water. Yuri felt the stomach-turning lurch of weightlessness, the sensation of an elevator cable snapping. The roar of the engines changed pitch, the turbines howling as the airflow became chaotic. He pushed the yoke forward, trying to regain the cushion, trying to dive back into the safety of the ground effect. It was too late. The atmosphere flowed over the wings without gripping them. They were falling. The tail struck first. It did not splash. Water, when struck at 400 kilometers per hour, does not yield like liquid. It resists like granite. The impact was not a sound. It was a tectonic event. The rear fuselage slammed into the Caspian. The aluminum skin sheared, peeling back like the skin of a fruit. The structural spine of the aircraft, the keel beam designed to hold the weight of the massive tail, snapped with the sound of a cannon shot. The tail section acted as a massive hydraulic brake. The rear of the craft stopped instantly, anchored by the water. The front of the craft, still moving at 400 kilometers per hour, kept going. Inside the cockpit, the world disintegrated. Yuri was thrown forward against his harness, the straps cutting into his chest with enough force to crack ribs. The instrument panel exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. The fuselage buckled amidships. The metal screamed, a high-pitched tearing sound that drowned out the dying roar of the jets. The KM folded in half. Titanium panels, rivets, and hydraulic lines flew into the air, spinning like shrapnel. The engines, mounted on the forward canard, were still screaming at full military power. As the nose slammed into the water, the intakes submerged. 10 Derbent turbojets ingested the Caspian Sea. The compressor blades, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, met the incompressible water. They shattered. The engines exploded, tearing themselves from the pylons in bursts of superheated steam and orange flame. The fire lasted only a second. The Caspian rushed in. Cold, oily, dark water flooded the broken hull. It surged through the fractured spine, extinguishing the flames, shorting out the electrical systems. In the cockpit, the lights died. Yuri hung in his harness, dazed, the taste of blood warm in his mouth. The roar was gone. The vibration was gone. There was only the terrifying gurgle of rushing water. Report. Yuri croaked, fumbling for the release buckle. Silence answered him. The co-pilot slumped forward, motionless. The water rose around Yuri's boots. It was freezing. It rose to his knees, his waist. The cockpit was tilting, the nose dragging them down. The buoyancy was gone. The KM was not a ship. It lacked the watertight bulkheads of a vessel designed to float. It was an airplane that had fallen into the sea. Yuri clawed at the overhead hatch. His fingers slipped on the wet metal. The angle was too steep. The water reached his chest. He realized, with a clarity that froze his heart, that the sky he had tried to reach was now the furthest thing away. From the deck of the chase boat, the scene was a tableau of ruin. The mist had swallowed the sound of the impact, leaving only the visual aftermath. The majestic, aggressive silhouette of the monster was gone. In its place, a broken ruin wallowed in the swell. Smoke, black and oily, drifted low over the water. Rostislav Alexeyev lowered the binoculars. His hands trembled, the vibration traveling up his arms to his shoulders. He felt old. Hard to starboard. Dmitri shouted to the captain. Full speed. Get the rescue teams ready. Alexeyev did not move. He watched the tail section. It stuck up at an unnatural, jagged angle, like a tombstone marking a fresh grave. He saw the physics of the crash played out in the wreckage. The broken spine, the shattered engines. He pulled up, Alexeyev whispered. The realization was bitter ash in his mouth. The fool pulled up. It was the human factor. He had built a machine that cheated nature, a machine that defied the density of water and the gravity of Earth. He had calculated the drag coefficients, the lift-to-drag ratios, the thrust vectors. But he had not calculated the reflex of a frightened man. The machine had held. The pilot had broken. The sinking was not dramatic. It was a surrender. The 500-ton Titan, stripped of its life, grew heavy. The water claimed the spaces where the air had once lived. The nose dipped lower, dragging the shattered fuselage down. The tail rose momentarily, a final, defiant gesture, before sliding backward into the murk. Bubbles of escaping air, massive and turbulent, broke the surface. Slick rainbows of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid spread across the gray waves, a psychedelic shroud for the dead beast. There was no explosion, no secondary detonation, just a heavy, suffocating silence. The sea closed over the wreck. The waves, indifferent to the tragedy, rolled over the spot, smoothing out the scar. The Caspian Monster was gone. The rescue boats arrived 10 minutes later. Men in orange survival suits dove into the freezing sludge, pulling the stunned survivors from the floating debris. Alexeyev watched them pull Yuri from the water. The pilot was alive, coughing up seawater, his face a mask of shock and blood. Dmitri stood beside Alexeyev, staring at the empty patch of ocean. "We can recover it," Dmitri said, his voice hollow. "We can bring in the floating cranes. We can raise the hull." Alexeyev shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "But the data, the flight recorders, the hull is broken, Dmitri. The spine is snapped." Alexeyev turned away from the railing. He looked at the gray sky, the heavy, oppressive ceiling that had crushed his dream. "Moscow will not pay for a salvage," Alexeyev said. "The economy is rotting. The war in Afghanistan, the factories are empty." He wiped a hand across his face, smearing the salt spray. "They will leave it there. They will let the silt cover it." He looked back one last time. The ocean was empty. The radar blind spot was truly empty now. "The monster is dead," Alexeyev said. He walked into the cabin of the chase boat, closing the door against the cold, leaving the graveyard of the Caspian behind. The legacy of the machine would not be a fleet of Ekranoplans connecting the world. It would be a rust stain on the seafloor and a ghost story told in the briefing rooms of the CIA. The silence of the Gorky shipyards was not the quiet of sleep. It was the quiet of death. For decades, these hangars had rung with the symphony of superpower ambition, the shrieking of grinders on titanium, the percussive rhythm of rivet guns, the shouting of men building the end of the world. Now, the air hung stagnant, thick with the smell of ungreased chains and settling dust. The Soviet Union did not end with a bang. It ended with a budget cut. The flow of rubles, once a torrent that allowed Rostislav Alexeyev to defy gravity, slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The empire collapsed under the weight of its own concrete. In the design bureau, the drafting tables were abandoned, covered in sheets of plastic that yellowed in the sun. Blueprints for Leviathan's larger, faster, nuclear-powered Ekranoplans designed to span the Pacific were rolled up and shoved into damp archives, food for mice and mold. The engineers, men who had mastered the hydrodynamics of the ground effect, wandered the empty cathedral-like spaces like ghosts. They wore oil-stained coats and smoked cheap cigarettes, waiting for orders that would never come. They were the architects of a future that had been cancelled. But in the chaos of the dissolution, one monster survived. It was not the KM. That beast lay broken on the floor of the Caspian, a shrine to Icarus. Its successor, Project 903, the Lun Ekranoplan, sat at the pier in the naval town of Kaspiask. It was a refinement of the nightmare. Where the KM was a transport, the Lun was a predator. It bristled with aggression. Mounted on its dorsal spine were 6 massive cylinders, slanted forward like the quills of a porcupine. It was a dragon born too late to breathe fire. It entered service in 1987, a terrifying weapon commissioned by a government that ceased to exist 4 years later. For 30 years, it sat rotting. It became an orphan of history. The Russian Federation, struggling to feed its people, had no use for a fuel-guzzling hybrid that required a specialized pilot and COMSES. The Lun was a line item crossed out in red ink. Conscripts guarded it with indifferent lethargy, trading siphoned aviation kerosene for vodka and cigarettes. The monster became a dock queen, a storage locker for seagulls, its terrifying potential rusting away one rainy season at a time. The decision, when it finally came, was not military but cosmetic. The Ministry of Defense wanted to clean house. They decreed that the Lun would be moved to a Patriot Park near the ancient city of Derbent, a museum piece for a war that never happened. The journey was a funeral procession. A fleet of tugboats arrived at the Caspian pier. They attached thick steel cables to the nose of the Ekranoplan, shackle by heavy shackle. There was no dignity in it. This was a machine built to sprint at 500 kilometers per hour, to skim the waves faster than the eye could track. Now it was dragged through the water at walking speed. The tugs pulled. The cables groaned. The Lun wallowed in the swell, a humiliated giant stripped of its power. It bobbed helplessly, its massive hull displacing water it was meant to fly over. On the shore, locals stopped their cars to watch the gray phantom pass. Old men, veterans of the Soviet Navy, took off their caps. Young men filmed it on their phones, pixelated images of a past they didn't understand. The Lun passed like a dream fading in the morning light, heading south to its final resting place. Derbent Beach, the edge of the graveyard. The tugboats winched the beast up onto the sand. The operation was crude, a brute force beaching that left the hull grinding against the grit. Then the cables were detached. The engines of the tugs faded into the distance. The Lun was left alone. It sits there today, stranded between the sea and the land, belonging to neither. From a distance it defies logic. The sheer scale of the object disrupts the horizon. It looks like the carcass of a colossal mechanical whale that washed ashore and died, too heavy for the tide to reclaim. It is a surreal monolith, a dark gray stain on the golden sand, imposing and pathetic all at once. The Caspian Sea, the element it was built to conquer, laps gently at its tail, a slow, patient acid eating away at the aluminum. Nature is reclaiming the weapon. The corrosion is relentless. The salt spray, carried by the wind, coats the fuselage daily. It feeds the rust that spreads like a leprosy across the metal skin. The paint, once a formidable radar-absorbent gray, peels in long, ragged strips, fluttering in the breeze like dead skin. The windows of the cockpit, once pristine optical glass, are yellowed and opaque, clouded by UV radiation and sandstorms. They look like the cataracts of a blind old man, staring out at a sea he can no longer navigate. The most striking feature remains the teeth. The 6 missile tubes dominate the silhouette. They rise from the spine of the craft, grouped in pairs, casting long, aggressive shadows across the beach. They point forward, aimed at a theoretical American aircraft carrier that has long since been scrapped. But they are empty. The P-270 Moskit missiles, the supersonic Sunburns that terrified Robert Vance and Jack Simmons in the bowels of the CIA, were removed decades ago. The tubes are no longer cannons. They are wind tunnels. High up in the empty launch chambers, where nuclear fire was meant to live, pigeons have built their nests. The cooing of birds echoes in the steel cylinders, replacing the roar of rocket boosters. The wind whistles through the open tubes, playing a mournful, flute-like dirge. It is the sound of a hollow threat. A black SUV tore across the sand, its tires kicking up plumes of dust. It skidded to a halt near the left wing of the Lun, the bass of a pop song thumping from its speakers. Alexei stepped out. He was 20 years old, dressed in limited edition sneakers and a hoodie emblazoned with a Western luxury logo. He held an energy drink in one hand and a smartphone attached to a selfie stick in the other. To Alexei, this was not a weapon. It was not a tragedy of engineering. It was content. He walked right up to the hull, ignoring the rusted danger signs that had fallen into the sand. The security fence was broken, trampled by thousands of feet before his. The Lun had become an accidental tourist attraction, a pilgrimage site for the Instagram generation. Alexei turned his back to the machine. He held up the phone, framing his face against the looming gray backdrop of the fuselage. He smiled, a practiced plastic expression, and snapped a burst of photos. Click, click, click. He checked the screen. Perfect lighting. The contrast of his bright clothes against the dying metal would get likes. He climbed onto the wing. The aluminum groaned under his weight, a sound of fatigue. He didn't hear it. He walked along the leading edge, treating the instrument of mass destruction like a jungle gym. He reached the fuselage and pulled a marker from his pocket. On a patch of peeling paint, right next to a faded technical stencil warning of high voltage, Alexei scrawled his social media handle in thick black ink. He tagged the corpse. He claimed it. He was the modern tourist, the symbol of oblivion. He stood on the shoulders of giants not to see further, but to be seen. Braver souls, or perhaps just more foolish ones, found the way inside. A cargo hatch under the wing hung open, the hydraulic strut long since broken. It was a dark, gaping mouth leading into the belly of the beast. The interior was a tomb that had been robbed. It was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of dry rot, bird guano, and ancient hydraulic fluid. Beams of sunlight pierced through bullet holes and rusted gaps in the hull, illuminating swirling dust motes. Looters had stripped the Lun to the bone. Every ounce of copper wiring had been ripped from the walls, leaving dangling bundles that looked like severed nerves. The analog gauges, with their radium dials, had been pried from the consoles. The titanium switchgear, the aluminum floor plates, even the heavy pilot's seat, all gone, sold for scrap rubles in the desperate markets of the 90s. What remained was a skeleton. The floor was a crunching carpet of broken glass and debris. Empty beer bottles and crushed cans littered the corners, the refuse of teenagers who used the Ekranoplan as a clubhouse. The bulkheads were covered in graffiti, names, dates, crude drawings, obscene jokes. The sophisticated electronics that once calculated intercept vectors at Mach 3 were replaced by the scrawlings of bored children. It was a chaotic mess. The dignity of the machine had been eviscerated. Yet in the cockpit something lingered. To stand on the flight deck, even amidst the ruin, was to feel the ghost of the ambition. The layout of the smashed instrument panels still spoke of the intense discipline required to fly the monster. The throttle quadrant, stripped of its levers, still sat in the center, wide enough to control 8 engines. It was a haunted space. Looking out through the cloudy, yellowed glass, the view was still the same. The endless, flat expanse of the Caspian. One could almost feel the presence of the phantom pilots. Men like Yuri Volkov, who had sat in the seat, sweating in their flight suits, their hearts hammering as they pushed the throttles forward. One could imagine the vibration, the roar, the sheer, terrifying focus of riding the cushion at 300 knots. The silence in the cockpit was heavy. It was filled with the what-ifs of history. What if the Soviet economy hadn't collapsed? What if the fleet had been built? What if the Cold War had turned hot? The Lun offered no answers. It only offered the sound of the wind rattling a loose panel, a metallic clicking that sounded like a clock ticking down to nothing. From the beach, looking back, the Lun was more than just junk. It was a monument to a specific kind of hubris. It represented a civilization that prioritized military power over everything else, over bread, over infrastructure, over the happiness of its people. It had poured its genius into machines of death, only to collapse from within, leaving the machines to starve. It stood as a tombstone for the Soviet Union itself. Massive, intimidating, technologically advanced, but ultimately hollow and abandoned. It was a physical manifestation of the Cold War. A terrifying standoff that ended not with a bang, but with a slow, rusting whimper on a lonely beach. The sun began to set over Derbent. The light turned golden, casting long, dramatic shadows across the sand. The Lun absorbed the light, turning a deep, bruised purple. High above, 300 miles into the vacuum, a satellite passed overhead. It was an American KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, the great-grandchild of the keyhole system that had delivered the first film canister to Robert Vance. Its digital eye looked down. It scanned the Caspian coast. There was no panic at Langley anymore. No analysts rushed to the White House with flash priority folders. No one drew geometry on a whiteboard to calculate the end of the world. The image appeared on a screen in a quiet, air-conditioned room in Virginia. An automated algorithm flagged the object, cross-referenced it with the database, and dismissed it. Target: Class Lun. Status: inactive/scrap. Coordinates: unchanged. The monster that once blurred on the film due to its speed, the phantom that lived in the blind spot of the radar, was now perfectly sharp and still. It was pinned to the earth by gravity and time, as harmless as a driftwood log. As the darkness swallowed the beach, the Lun looked almost beautiful in its tragedy. It was a retrofuturistic dream that failed to launch. It reminded the observer of a timeline where humanity might have skimmed the waves in giant ships, a future of speed and daring that was abandoned for safety and efficiency. It was a vision from a pulp science fiction novel, stranded in the mundane reality of the 21st century. The tourists drove away, their taillights fading into the distance. The music stopped. The beach was quiet, save for the lapping of the waves. The Lun waited. It waited for orders that would never come. It waited for fuel that would never be pumped. It waited for pilots who were long dead. It rotted alone, a king without a kingdom, the aluminum skin slowly turning to white dust, returning to the earth from which it was made. The Cold War was over, and the monster had lost.